pandemics, global economic crashes, one-of-a-kind conjunctions in the constellations, wars in the Middle East, a peace deal involving Israel. Which ones of these are signs of Jesus' coming and which ones aren't? Because frankly, we're seeing all of these things right now, all at the same time. So what are signs and what aren't signs? We really need to know the difference, and Jesus was very specific about what are signs of the end and what aren't. And we're going to answer that later, but first, a spoiler alert. So get ready. Earthquakes. Until recently, I thought they were a sign of the end, and guess what? I was mistaken. They aren't. And if you want to know why they aren't, and what else isn't a sign, we need to apply what this community already knows, that only Scripture should determine what is truly a sign. Only Scripture. But first, before we look at Scripture, we need to sweep clean our minds of the man-made theories that we filled them with about what we've been told are signs. So take a deep breath, because I know a lot of these things are deeply loved theories. But if I was mistaken and other prophecy teachers are still mistaken, we can all be mistaken. But I'm sure you agree that there are very few prophetic questions that are more important. When we turn to Matthew 24, straight from the lips of Jesus, he gives us a list of the things that are signs of his coming and what aren't signs of his coming. But before we look at what Jesus says, what is a sign? It is something specific, it's one of a kind, and it's unmistakable. In other words, we can't get it wrong. Like this stop sign. Everyone recognizes it for what it is. When I was a teenager, I thought I could avoid what it really meant. But everyone knows what it means. A not sign is something that's general, that happens a lot, and something you could easily get wrong. That's why earthquakes are not a sign. They happen a lot, many per year, and besides that, Jesus specifically said earthquakes weren't signs, and we'll get to that shortly. Now, in order to understand this whole discussion about the signs of Jesus' return, we have to go back to the beginning of his discussion, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on what we call Holy Week. The praise Jesus received on Palm Sunday and from the crowds he taught infuriated the Pharisees and Sadducees, who then began to challenge Jesus' authority and tried to trick him. They thought they were so clever, but they were in for a surprise. Of course, trying to trick God is impossible, and at every question, Jesus turned their tricky questions around on them. Then it was Jesus' turn, and he told them what he thought of them in no uncertain terms, calling them a brood of vipers and whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones, for leading astray the people of Jerusalem. On their way out of the temple, after this confrontation, the disciples tried to break the tension by commenting on the beautiful, giant Herodian stones that the temple was built out of. Jesus had a surprise for them as well. He prophesied the temple would be destroyed and not one of the stones would be left on another. Now the disciples knew their Bible, and they realized the book of Daniel prophesied the destruction of a temple and connected it to the 70 weeks prophecy. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. They must have assumed that the destruction of the city and temple would happen soon, and that this would be the end when Jesus would usher in his millennial kingdom. So later that day, when they were alone on the Mount of Olives, they asked him the logical question, the same one we're asking today. Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? They wanted to know when this would happen and what would be the sign. I'm sure all of us would ask Jesus the same thing if he was here today. And luckily, we have his answer recorded in the following verses. So let's dig into it and see what he said. Jesus answered them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of war. See to it that you are not frightened, for these things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs." In these verses, Jesus prophesied a number of things that were going to happen in these verses. But that doesn't make them signs. This whole group of events, which we call the beginning of the birth pangs, are the not signs. They are general things that are going to happen, but aren't the signs of the end times. Notice what Jesus says about wars and false messiahs. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Look what he says about famines and earthquakes, the same thing, but all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs. Jesus was great at explaining things in terms of analogies. He said the end times were like a pregnancy. It goes on for quite a while with no pain. But a couple of weeks or a month prior to the delivery, some mild contractions begin. The beginning of the birth pangs. These are the early warnings to the woman that birth is getting closer, but it isn't a sign. Then, right before the birth, the woman's water breaks and severe contractions begin. This is the sign that the time for her delivery is here. Jesus explains the end times in the same way. Some mild events, mild in regard to what is going to come later, occur an indeterminate time before the end, and you aren't sure how long it will be. And then the signs of the end occur. So all these things that happen in the beginning of the birth pangs period that so many think are the signs of the end aren't signs. Earthquakes, wars, the coming of false messiahs, famine and disease. These are things that have happened throughout history and will continue to happen. They are warnings that we're getting closer, but they aren't the sign. Notice what else isn't a sign. A peace treaty between the Antichrist and Israel. The disciples specifically asked Jesus for signs, but that is not one he told them to watch for. Why? Well, maybe it's something no one sees, or maybe something no one knows about. Or it might be that most people's understanding of Daniel 9:27 is off, and that it's not speaking of a peace treaty at all. Either way, a peace treaty isn't a sign of the end, according to Jesus. We need to keep these things in mind because 50% of the posts on social media are about exactly the things that Jesus told us aren't signs: wars, famines, earthquake, disease, and an Israeli peace treaty. These aren't the signs. They're just warnings that we're getting closer. So when we hear about a peace treaty or a new war or an escalation of earthquakes, or even the coronavirus, these things aren't signs, they're warnings. His coming is getting closer. Now, if you're one of the loyal watchers of this channel, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, "Nelson, in this previous video, you proved that the events of Matthew 24, which include these not signs that you're saying are the beginning of the birth pangs, were the same as Revelation 6. That the odds of them not being the same was 6 trillion to 1. So it's a 1-to-1 identity. And since the first 3 seals on the scroll that Jesus opens are these same events, the beginning of the birth pangs. Nelson, what you're saying is that those aren't signs of his coming. How could that be? What I'm saying is that Jesus is saying that these aren't signs of his coming. How many wars have there been? How many Mideast peace plans? So even when we see the real events, the first seal, the second seal, the third seal opened, will we recognize them? I don't think we will, because there have been so many similar events in the past. So it's just my opinion, but I believe we won't know the first 3 seals have opened until we look back on them. Because this is what Jesus says, that they are not the sign. But what aren't signs is only half the message, because Jesus told us specifically what is the sign. So what is the sign of the end that Jesus mentioned? If you want to keep watching, well, click right here and we'll go over it in detail. This is Nelson, and I'll see you there.